James had always dreamed of traveling the world. Growing up in a small town, he had seen pictures of famous landmarks in books and on TV, but nothing compared to actually being there. So when he finally got the chance to visit London, he was beyond excited. He had planned every detail of his trip: Big Ben, the London Eye, the Tower of London. But there was one thing he was especially looking forward to: seeing the royal guards at Buckingham Palace. Ever since he was a kid, James had heard stories about these guards. They were known for standing completely still, no matter what happened around them. People would try to make them laugh or move, but they never reacted. To James, it seemed almost unreal. How could someone stay so serious with all the tourists trying to distract them? He had seen videos online of people making funny faces, doing silly dances, and even talking to the guards, all without getting a single reaction. James found it both impressive and amusing. On a bright, sunny afternoon, he finally arrived at Buckingham Palace. The crowd was huge, with tourists from all over the world taking pictures and admiring the grand building. But James's eyes were fixed on the guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. They stood like statues, rifles in hand, their faces completely blank. James took out his phone and started recording. "Wow," he whispered to himself. "They don't even blink." As he moved closer, he noticed other tourists trying to interact with the guards. Some stood beside them for pictures, while others waved their hands in front of their faces. The guards didn't move an inch. James chuckled. "This is crazy," he thought. "They're like robots." Then he overheard a group of tourists laughing and talking about a prank. One of them joked about pretending to take the guard's hat, while another laughed and said, "Imagine if someone touched their gun." James smirked. He didn't think anyone would actually do that. But the idea of testing the guard's reaction stayed in his mind. He wasn't planning anything serious. Just something small, something harmless. Maybe he could lightly touch the rifle for a second, just to see if the guard would react. After all, it was just for fun, right? As he stood there, the idea started to feel more tempting. The other tourists were busy with their own pictures and jokes, and no one seemed to notice what he was thinking. He imagined himself as the guy who finally got a royal guard to move. That would make a great story to tell his friends back home. He hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity was too strong. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, his hand slowly reaching out toward the guard's rifle. His heart pounded in his chest, and he grinned, expecting nothing to happen. But James had no idea what was coming next. James felt a rush of excitement as his fingers brushed against the cold metal of the guard's rifle. It was just for a second, barely even a touch, but at that moment, everything changed. Before he could even think, the guard moved. It was fast, sharp, and completely unexpected. The still, statue-like soldier suddenly came to life. With a firm step forward, he yanked his rifle back and took a strong stance. His voice boomed through the air, making James freeze in place. "Stand back." The command was so loud, so powerful, that it felt like the entire ground shook beneath James's feet. The people around them gasped, some stepping back in shock. A few even reached for their phones, realizing they had just witnessed something rare, one of the royal guards actually reacting. James's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He thought the guards never moved. He thought they ignored everything. But now, standing in front of the tall, serious soldier, he realized he had been very, very wrong. The guard's eyes were locked onto him, cold and unshaken. His grip on the rifle was firm, and his posture was straight, showing no sign of hesitation. He wasn't joking. He wasn't playing around. James quickly pulled his hands back and raised them slightly, trying to show he meant no harm. I was just messing around," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The guard didn't respond. He simply stood there, still as a rock once again, but something had changed. The moment had passed, but the tension still lingered in the air. People started whispering around him. Some were laughing nervously, while others shook their heads in disapproval. James could hear someone mutter, "That was a bad idea," while another person whispered, "He's lucky nothing worse happened." James swallowed hard. Lucky? What did they mean by that? He looked around and noticed a second guard nearby. He hadn't moved yet, but his eyes were watching everything. Then, James realized something even more concerning. Two palace security officers were walking toward him. They weren't running, but their steps were quick and firm, their faces serious. His stomach dropped. This isn't good, he thought. James took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. Maybe he could explain. Maybe they would understand it was just a harmless joke. But as the officers got closer, he could tell that no one here found it funny. His little prank had gone too far, and now he had to face the consequences. James felt his legs grow heavy as the two palace security officers approached. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms grew sweaty. The crowd around him had gone quiet, their eyes shifting between him and the guards. He suddenly felt like all of Buckingham Palace was watching. The officers stopped right in front of him. Their expressions were serious, not angry, but firm, like they had seen situations like this before and knew exactly how to handle them. One of them, a tall man with a strong build, spoke first. "Sir, step to the side." James hesitated for a second, but when he saw the officer's eyes, he knew this wasn't a request. He swallowed hard and moved away from the main crowd, closer to the side where fewer people were standing. The second officer walked beside him, making sure he didn't try to slip away. "Do you know what you just did?" the first officer asked, crossing his arms. James shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a joke," he said quickly. "I didn't mean any harm." The officer didn't react to his words. "You touched a royal guard's weapon," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That is a serious offense." James's stomach twisted. He hadn't thought of it that way. In his mind, it was just a lighthearted prank, something to laugh about later. But now, hearing the officer say it out loud, it sounded much worse. I wasn't trying to take it or anything," James explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just wanted to see if he'd react." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, sighed and shook her head. "They react when necessary," she said. "And today, you crossed the line." James could feel the weight of his mistake settling on his shoulders. He looked back at the guard he had touched. The soldier had returned to his still position, his face blank once again. It was like nothing had happened. But James knew better. That 1 second of foolishness had been enough to turn everything upside down. The first officer pulled out a small notepad. "We're going to need some identification," he said. "Passport, ID, whatever you have." James quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out his passport, his hands shaking slightly. The officer took it and looked at it carefully before jotting something down. "Will I get arrested?" James asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers didn't answer right away. The woman looked at him closely, as if trying to decide something. Then she said, "That depends." James's throat went dry. "On what?" he asked nervously. The officer flipped her notepad closed. "On how serious they decide to take this," she said. "And right now, they're deciding." James felt a chill run down his spine. This was no longer just a joke. This was real. And it wasn't over yet. James stood there, his heart pounding as he watched the officers exchange glances. The weight of the situation was sinking in faster than he could process. What had started as a playful prank had now turned into something far more serious. The tall officer holding his passport looked at him again. "Follow us," he said firmly. James hesitated but knew he had no choice. He nodded and walked with them, his mind racing. The crowd behind him started whispering again. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't dare turn around. He had never felt this embarrassed in his life. The officers led him to a quieter area near the palace gates, away from the main crowd. The third officer was already there, waiting. He was older, with a commanding presence, and his uniform looked slightly different from the others. He was clearly in charge. The female officer spoke first. "Sir, this man touched a Royal Guard's weapon." The older officer's expression didn't change. He simply looked at James, his eyes sharp and unreadable. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. James cleared his throat nervously. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I wasn't trying to take it or cause any trouble," he said, hoping they would see that he wasn't dangerous. The officer finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Do you know why these guards are here?" James hesitated. "To protect the palace," he guessed. The officer nodded. "That's right. And do you know what their duty is?" James swallowed. "To stand guard." The officer narrowed his eyes. "Their duty is to protect this place at all costs. Their training is serious, and their weapons are real. You may have thought it was a joke, but to them, it wasn't." James felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't thought about it that way. To him, they had just been tourist attractions, part of the experience of visiting London. But now he understood. These were real soldiers doing a real job, and he had just interfered with it. I get it now," James admitted, his voice quieter. "I wasn't thinking." The officer studied him for a moment, then sighed. "We have two choices," he said. "We can take this further, report the incident officially, have you detained, and possibly ban you from returning to the UK." James felt his stomach drop. His breathing became uneven. Was this really happening? The officer continued, "Or we issue a warning and a fine, and you leave here understanding that what you did was not acceptable." James didn't even hesitate. "The second one, please." The officers exchanged looks again. Then the older officer nodded. "You'll be fined, and this will go on record. If you ever do anything like this again, you won't be given another chance." James exhaled deeply, a wave of relief washing over him. He had made a terrible mistake, but he had been lucky this time. As they handed him back his passport and explained the fine process, he knew one thing for sure. This was a lesson he would never forget. James stood still, gripping his passport tightly as the officer finished explaining the fine. His face was warm with embarrassment, and his hands felt sweaty. He could hardly believe how quickly things had escalated. A few minutes ago, he had been laughing and joking with other tourists, thinking he was just having fun. Now he was facing an official warning and a fine that he would have to pay before leaving the country. The officer handed him a small paper slip. "This is your fine notice," he said. "You must pay it before you leave the UK, or it will cause legal trouble the next time you visit." James nodded quickly. "Understood." The officer's eyes stayed locked on him for a moment longer, as if making sure he truly got the message. Then, with a slight nod, he stepped back. "You're free to go." James let out a quiet breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He gave a small, awkward thank you, even though he wasn't sure if that was the right thing to say. Without wasting another second, he turned and started walking away from the palace, his legs still a little shaky. As he moved through the crowd, he could feel people staring at him. Some whispered, others shook their heads, and a few had their phones out, probably recording. His face burned with embarrassment. He wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. Reaching the main road, James stopped and leaned against a railing, taking a deep breath. His heart was still racing. He had never been in trouble like this before. Back home, he was just a regular guy, a tourist who liked to explore and have fun. He never thought he would end up on the wrong side of the law, even if it was just a fine. Pulling out his phone, he searched for information about royal guards. As he read, he realized just how strict their rules were. They weren't just for show. These soldiers trained hard, followed strict protocols, and took their jobs seriously. Some of them had even served in the military before being assigned to Buckingham Palace. James sighed and rubbed his face. "I was an idiot," he muttered to himself. He knew he had been lucky. If the officers had decided to make an example out of him, things could have been much worse. He could have been arrested or even banned from visiting the UK again. That thought alone made his stomach turn. Deciding he had enough excitement for one day, James slowly walked back toward his hotel. His trip to London wasn't over yet, but his carefree attitude was. He had learned a hard lesson, one he wouldn't forget anytime soon. As he crossed the street, he made a silent promise to himself. No more pranks, no more testing limits, and definitely no more messing with royal guards. This time, he had gotten off easy, but he wasn't going to push his luck again. James walked slowly through the streets of London, still thinking about what had happened at Buckingham Palace. The city around him was full of life. Tourists taking pictures, locals rushing to work, street performers entertaining crowds. But he felt disconnected from it all. His mind kept replaying the moment when the guard moved, the officer's serious face, and the heavy warning he had received. Stopping at a small cafe, he decided to sit down and clear his head. He ordered a cup of coffee and found a seat by the window. As he sipped his drink, he pulled out his phone and checked his messages. His friends had sent texts asking about his trip, expecting fun stories and exciting pictures. He hesitated, wondering if he should tell them what had happened. He sighed and started typing. "Guys, I almost got into serious trouble today. Tried to joke around with a royal guard. Bad idea. Got fined and almost banned from coming back." Within seconds, his phone buzzed with replies. "Wait, what? What did you do? Bro, are you serious? Why would you mess with a guard? Lol, did you get it on video?" James shook his head. Some of his friends found it funny, but he knew it wasn't a joke. He typed back, "Trust me, it wasn't funny. Those guards don't play around. I got lucky." As he put his phone down, he noticed an elderly man sitting at the table next to him. The man had been quietly reading a newspaper, but now he was looking at James with a small smile. "You had a little trouble at the palace, didn't you?" the man said, his voice calm. James blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" The man chuckled. "I was there. I saw it happen." James felt his face heat up. "Oh, yeah, that was me." The man nodded. "You learned an important lesson today." James sighed. "Yeah, I did. I didn't think it was a big deal at first, but now I see how serious it was." The man took a sip of his tea before speaking again. "Tourists sometimes forget that those guards are not just part of the scenery. They are trained professionals, and their job is to protect. If they react, it's because they need to." James nodded slowly. "I get it now. I just wish I had thought about that before acting like a fool." The man smiled. "Making mistakes is part of life. The important thing is learning from them." James took a deep breath. The man was right. He had been reckless, but he wouldn't make the same mistake again. As he finished his coffee, James felt lighter. His trip wasn't ruined, and he still had time to enjoy London. But from now on, he would be more careful and more respectful. This was one lesson he wouldn't forget. James left the cafe feeling a little better. Talking to the elderly man had helped him understand things in a new way. He had made a mistake, but it didn't mean his whole trip was ruined. He still had time to make better choices and enjoy London the right way. As he walked through the city, he decided to visit some landmarks where he wouldn't get into trouble. He took a bus to the Tower of London, where he admired the historic castle and learned about its past. He walked along the River Thames, taking pictures of Tower Bridge and watching boats pass by. For the first time that day, he felt relaxed. Later in the afternoon, he found himself near a souvenir shop. He stepped inside, looking at the small trinkets, keychains, and postcards. As he browsed, he overheard a group of young tourists laughing loudly. One of them, a tall guy wearing a backpack, was talking excitedly. "Dude, I saw this video where someone made a guard move. We should try it. Let's see if we can get them to react." James's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what they were planning. The memory of his own mistake was still fresh in his mind. He hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. He walked over to them. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The group turned to look at him, surprised. "Why not?" the tall guy asked. James sighed. "Because I did the same thing this morning. And trust me, it didn't end well." The tourists looked curious now. "What happened?" one of them asked. James gave them a quick summary, how he had touched the guard's rifle as a joke, how the guard reacted immediately, and how security officers had confronted him. When he mentioned the fine and the possibility of being banned from the UK, the tourists' expressions changed. "Whoa," the tall guy said, suddenly looking less excited. "I thought they just stood still no matter what." James shook his head. "Nope, they're serious about their job. And if you mess with them, you're the one who gets in trouble, not them." The group exchanged nervous glances. One of them chuckled awkwardly. "Guess we'll just take normal pictures instead." James smiled. "Good idea." As he left the shop, he felt a sense of relief. Maybe he couldn't change what he had done, but at least he had stopped someone else from making the same mistake. It wasn't much, but it made him feel a little better. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the city. James took a deep breath and looked around. London was still beautiful, still full of adventure. He just had to experience it the right way. With a lighter heart, he continued his journey, ready to make the rest of his trip memorable, for all the right reasons. As James walked through the streets of London, he felt different than he had in the morning. The day had started with a foolish mistake, but now he felt wiser. He had learned something important, not just about the royal guards, but about respect, responsibility, and how small actions can have big consequences. He decided to end his day with something peaceful, so he headed toward Hyde Park. The large green space was filled with people, some jogging, some sitting on benches, and others simply enjoying the fresh air. He found a quiet spot near the lake and sat down, watching the ducks glide across the water. James took out his phone and opened his messages. His friends had sent more texts, some still laughing at his mistake, others asking if he was okay. He thought for a moment, then started typing. "Yeah, I messed up, but I learned my lesson. It wasn't funny, and I don't want anyone else making the same mistake. London is amazing, and I almost ruined my trip by being careless. Not worth it." A few minutes later, one of his friends replied, "Good to know. Maybe we'll actually learn from you for once." James chuckled. At least something good had come out of it. As he sat there, he thought back to the group of tourists he had warned earlier. He was glad he had spoken to them. Maybe they would have learned the hard way like he did, but now they wouldn't have to. He realized that sometimes the best thing you can do after making a mistake is to help others avoid the same one. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. James sighed, feeling a sense of peace. He had been lucky today. Things could have gone much worse, but he had been given a second chance. He promised himself he wouldn't take it for granted. Standing up, he stretched and started walking back toward his hotel. He still had a few more days left in London, and he wanted to make the most of them. There was so much to see and experience: the museums, the markets, the historic streets. As he walked past Buckingham Palace one last time that evening, he looked at the guards standing tall and still in their positions. This time, he didn't see them as just part of the tourist attraction. He saw them as soldiers, as professionals, as people who took their duty seriously. He gave a small nod of respect before moving on. James had started the day with a mistake, but he was ending it with a lesson. And sometimes that was the best kind of adventure. With a new mindset and a fresh appreciation for the city, he smiled to himself and disappeared into the crowd, ready to enjoy the rest of his journey the right way.